Corbolic V2. This is a super safe and effective natural anabolic. Not only is this product going to help you increase protein synthesis, which basically means muscle recovery and growth, it also may inhibit myostatin, which is a protein in your body that is known to inhibit muscle growth. This is a complete natural anabolic that works through multiple different pathways, has multiple trademarked ingredients. If you are a natural athlete looking for that edge, Corbolic V2 is what you need. Get yourself some.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Pro Physique Code. Today we got a couple topics we're going to cover. I think the first and foremost, we're going to talk about, listen, it's prep season, guys. We're in a little bit of a lull. So we're going to talk about dangerous prep protocols of things that we've seen that have been problematic. And then Lexi, you had a couple topics that sounded like something we could get into, because I don't want to go too long on the dangerous prep protocols, but we'll get into some stuff about competing around the sport itself. But really the reason I want to talk about dangerous prep protocols is because this is the time of year where I get on some phone calls with some people. And I just want to help educate. There's not a lot of resources for competitors, and maybe there's even like an overabundance of information out there. Can feel a little bit confusing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that social media and like the world we live in now, it's great. There's so many resources, information out there, but it's also like it can be very overwhelming. And I saw like a great post yesterday, actually, ironically, about somebody posting like, just because your coach isn't having you do something, or having you do a certain method, and then you see that certain method being implemented, by another coach to another athlete online, doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. Like there's just so many different approaches to things. There's so many things out there you can do as an athlete. And it can be very overwhelming on social media, because I think we've all probably had scenarios too where you'll have a client reach out and they're like, oh, I saw so-and-so doing this or taking this, like, should I be doing this? And it's, and so we hear a lot of that as coaches.
Yeah, and everyone's trying to get eyeballs on them, right? So everyone's trying to reinvent at times when it doesn't need reinventing. And so everyone's always looking for something to grab attention and looking for that next little boost, that next little help, right? Sometimes it seems to be beneficial. A lot of times they're not. And that can be really confusing to a lot of people. And there's a bunch of information out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, honestly, the three of us had a conversation before we started this podcast about trusted resources in our space. It's very limiting, especially if you want to go the not natural route. I think you guys can tell me this, but I've been told I kind of have a reputation as being a coach that coaches more on the natural side, which historically was always the case. But, as I've, paid attention to the sport, I certainly have many athletes that are taking, performance enhancing stuff. And, now I'm actually reviewing blood work and doing things like that on a very specific level, because I want to provide that value to my athletes as well. But it's still a struggle to figure out who to trust in that space.
Very much so. It can potentially be scary too. I mean, we're talking your health, right? But yeah, it is hard to find reputable people and sources to, for some of these certain things we're going to talk about.
Yeah, well, so the reason I wanted to bring this up, guys, was I got a text message from my dad, who is going to be 75 years old this year, has never been to a bodybuilding show that I wasn't in, has never been on a forum, doesn't own any social media accounts. And he texted me and said, "Did you hear about the young lady that died at the Arnold?" And I immediately said, "Where did you hear that?" And he was like, "Oh, it's on mainstream news, and we live in Tampa, And so it was in Columbus, Ohio. I don't want to mention the young lady's name. I don't want to mention her coach. That's not really the point of this. That's been blasted all over. And I think some people do it for the wrong reasons. But essentially, she died of a heart attack at 20 years old due to severe dehydration. And I think what was implied was that it was potentially around some cutting techniques, some stuff she was using to look good potentially for the expo, which we've heard people before. I'm dieting for the Arnold. You're competing? No, I'm just going, because she was not competing. But then there's also, potentially she was recovering from being sick. And so some multifactorial, but I don't think there can ever be a reason for a 20-year-old to die of a heart attack at a fitness convention, right? Like
Yeah.
that's just shocking.
Yep.
Yeah, and actually, ironically enough, not to go into specifics at all, but I had an experience with somebody I knew years ago. When I was in like when I got into in-person personal training in college, the person that actually hired me, that same scenario happened to him too. Like, I remember one day waking up in our group work chat, like he was actually in his peak week, but very young, kind of same scenario, cardiac arrest. So yeah, I mean, this stuff happens and it's really scary.
Well, so let's talk about that specifically, because there are some very common factors that would cause cardiac arrest. Because I've had many a client tell me that in previous preps, they had arrhythmias, they had passed out, they had to go to the hospital. There was definitely multiple competitors that I've been at the shows that people have died, either at or during. Here in Tampa, there was a mother who was a women's physique competitor who died at the Tampa Pro a couple of years ago. My client was very close friends with a lady by the name of Nagy Shelton, who was in prep at the end of prep, potentially on some very harsh protocols, hit her head, and to this day, I believe she's, that's it. She's just brain dead, and so I don't think those things are necessary to be successful in the sport. And that's really rare. So you mentioned that person was in peak week. Do you know any specifics about that peak week protocol?
I have no idea. It was a male. So obviously I do remember. I mean, I knew him for a while before he hired me to work at the gym, and I do remember, like, think this was the second prep I had like observed him going through, and I mean, I remember he was one of those people at like 6 weeks out, just really, like, you could tell he was just miserable. I don't know the specifics of his approach, but just, and I know we all get to a point in prep, especially guys, where it's like you do you feel the prep feels towards the end. But I just always remember, like, that stood out to me as like, ooh, when he was in prep, like, you could just tell he was tired. Like, and I'd see him at like 5 a.m., 6 a.m., and he just looked like he was running on energy drinks. And yeah, so I don't know anything about his specific approach, but you know,
And look, we want to talk about generalities here with things too, because there's what coaches prescribe athletes and then what athletes do. Those are not always one and the same. A lot of times bodybuilders push themselves to extremes and the coach can say, hey, I want you to do this. And I've known some athletes like this that said, oh, my coach said do this, said take 2, so I'm going to take 4. And I'm
Right.
going to do it twice a day. Right. So
Right.
let's not always be careful where we place blame on things, because we
Well,
always don't
this
know the true
podcast is
story.
zero
But that's what
about
we're trying
blame.
to do. We're not trying
This
to do anything.
podcast is 100% about just information.
Yes.
And
yeah.
at no
Well,
point is putting your life at risk.
Worth
no,
it.
and I think that this is all stuff that's important to hear. And like, I honestly really hope that this podcast episode, I mean, gosh, if you're a bodybuilder listening to this, maybe share this with even your family. Cause like, I know when I first got into bodybuilding, I mean, I was young, but like my mom in particular, she believed all of the stereotypes out there. Cause that's what we hear about. Like, if you're a Gen Pop, you have no idea what the sport of bodybuilding is about. Like, you see, you just look up bodybuilders and you see all these like crazy articles about people dying and things like that. And as a Gen Pop person, you kind of believe those things, and you think that that's what it's all about. So like, our goal is to kind of shed light on, like, just informing people what is dangerous and what is not, and also the fact that like this sport can be, quote unquote, I don't want to say healthy, but like it can be done in a way where it doesn't deteriorate your long-term health.
Yeah.
No, it should benefit your life. There's definitely times in prep where you're a little run down, you're a little tired, and your body is not running at its best, but it looks the best it can for stage. That's called like trying to win and being, and pushing your body past its, past its probably, you know, optimal place. But in any endeavor that we do, we're doing that. No one's climbing a mountain. No one's racing a race car. No one's playing professional football and being the healthiest they can be and under all circumstances, right? We're always going to be pushing. The thing that most worries me about bodybuilding is I think we can feel a little bit invincible, and specifically with the heart being a muscle, when these approaches are taken with water loading, drastic water cutting, sodium cutting, potassium loading, these are literally the ingredients to stop a heart. And it only takes a brief second. Yeah, so that's the concern. And I just don't think people understand that that's literally what's at risk when you are, some people are taking like prescription strength diuretics along with cutting water and sodium.
Yeah, and I
And
think, like, Paul, you've mentioned the term before. I think it's summit fever, like where you just
Yeah.
get in the thick of something. And because I think we can all kind of sometimes be guilty of thinking, like, why would somebody do that? That's so silly. Like, what's going on in their head when they decide to do that? But there comes a point, and I'm not making like excuses or anything for people that do silly things towards end of prep, but like there gets to a point where I think some people just, they're in the thick of it. They're already so knee deep into prep, and they're like, all right, I'll do whatever it takes. Plus, when you're deep into prep, you don't always think like very logically because you're just so depleted, run down, lean. Sometimes you get that prep brain. But I think that summit fever has a lot to do with why some people take these really extreme approaches, whether it's prescribed by their coach or, like, Evan said a second ago, whether it's something that an athlete is choosing to kind of do behind closed doors because they think, oh, it's going to give them a little extra edge.
look, here's the deal with a lot of this stuff. Is the juice worth the squeeze with it? 99% of the time, it's not. It's not. So you can risk long-term issues for what, a 2% better look? Like it doesn't make any logical sense when you start thinking about it like that. It doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't make any sense to do that. If you need that little extra 2% to be able to win or to turn pro or anything like that and do something that could possibly put you in a bad place, or possibly forever or cause irreversible damage, is it worth it? And is that even something you want to be a part of? Like, you have to think about things like this. And these are decisions. The reason it's important to talk about it now at this point in the season is these are things to think about before you even start a prep. So if you consider doing things, or if a coach asks you to do something, these thoughts need to be in the back of your head with that. And now's
Yeah.
the time to consider that, not 2 weeks before a show. 2 weeks before a show, your brain's gonna be in a spot like, let's push to do what we need to do to win, right? But now's the time to kind of put those firm boundaries in place.
Yeah. So let's talk about some dangerous nutrition protocols. And I think the dangers of nutrition protocols are less acute, meaning like if your fats are really low, you're not going to have a heart attack. The most dangerous are the ones that are going to have that acute response, put you in the hospital, which I think is most closely associated with like peak week strategies, right? Even if things go well with the water cutting and the sodium cutting, I've seen people post show end up in the hospital from severe edema.
Yes.
Because they don't know that you can't just slam sodium and water and not have any consequences after you've had multiple days of dehydration. Ankles swelling, joints swelling, that can also make the heart swell. Like there's this huge pendulum swing in both directions, right? You get dehydrated, and then the show is over, and then the floodgates are loose. So just be aware that any shift like that is dangerous. And I'm not suggesting that you should never use a diuretic, that you should never reduce your water intake, that you should never reduce sodium intake. There are time and a place for those. But the issue is the kind of huge pendulum swings. We've talked at nauseum about the philosophies around peaking. I think if you have to take the drastic measures to cut water, you're likely not lean enough. The cells in our body, when you're shredded, don't hold water. You just don't. Like, you mostly look flatter. I think the caveat being, Evan, would be like men that are on multiple compounds that do cause a little fluid retention. There may be some reason there, but I'm not educated on that enough. And honestly, like that's where we had the most deaths was male bodybuilders. Wasn't it like 30 or 40 of them died in 1 year, like 21, 20, something like that? It was crazy.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of contributing factors, not to go down the rabbit hole on that,
Yeah,
but that I think
contributing
led into
factors, but
that.
still that
Yeah, it
many.
was a lot.
Yeah, it was, and one of them was in peak week at the Olympia. Um, Died in his room. So like,
Yeah, that's yeah. There's a lot to unpack about that. What that happened there. Um, it's a rabbit hole you can go down forever when it comes to that stuff, right? And it's about there's so many factors that play into this stuff, and especially if we talk about like the perform enhancing inside of it. Like you have to trust the products you're taking, you have to trust the coach that's prescribing them for you, and you have to have done your own research, and you need to pay attention to your body and how you feel. And when you start noticing things don't feel right, you need to bring it up. And if your coach does not take you serious, you need to make sure they take you serious, or you need to pull that alarm bell. Um, there's a difference between feeling bad and feeling run down and feeling like you are going to pass out, that you are so dizzy you can't move. If you get on a treadmill, you're going to fall down. Like those things. That's not
well,
being tired.
so let's talk about that because you bring up what you brought up just made me think of this. I had a very specific phone call a few years ago with a young lady who was working with a well-known coach, had her on zero fats for a long period of time, zero carbs, um, tons of cardio, and she wasn't responding very well. He was, berating her, accusing her of not following the plan. And then she told me, she's like, I've been having trouble with binge eating and I'm afraid to tell my coach. And I said, well, that's problem number one is you can't be honest with your coach because you're afraid of the repercussions. But I said, if I'm being honest, I think the binge eating is saving you because what's happening is you are so run down, exhausted, beat to hell. That is your body's way of going, hey, like we need this. Um, and so, luckily she left that coach and got herself in a better place. But let's talk about some potential reasons why we might run into a problem in a prep because of nutrition, cardio, lifestyle approaches.
Well, piggyback off one thing you said there, Paul, with that is I've seen that happen a lot of times where coaches put their athletes down really, really low, and especially females, they turn to the binging side. And I can tell you a lot of times that can take someone who used to have a healthy relationship with food and completely ruin it. That can cause eating disorders that struggle with people or stick with people for the
Well, and
rest
I
of their
mean, this
life.
is one of my core values as a coach is the idea that I don't put my athletes in a worse position when their season is
Yeah.
over than they were. I think it's very common to see coaches have a lot of success with very harsh protocols. They prop their clients up all prep, show them off when they get their pro card or they get their Olympia qualification or whatever they might get. And then that person disappears, for the lack of a better term.
Yeah.
They're almost ashamed to be on social media. They can never achieve that look again. They have eating disorder behaviors. If they didn't before, they might have them now. And so one of those core values for me has always been the idea of flexible dieting, meaning not creating a black and white mindset around like these are the foods you can eat in prep because this is what makes you successful. And anything else is basically wrong. Um, and that right there turns a normal person into a person with an eating disorder pretty quickly.
Yep.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's, and not 100% of the time is this true, but I think it's, really telltale about coaches when you can see like, oh yeah, they have these athletes that compete. And then those same athletes are, either sticking with that coach or continuing to be a thriving competitor, right? You'll start to notice a pattern sometimes with like certain coaches who have competitors, they compete, they do maybe really great for a season. And then like, you just never see that person again. You notice a pattern with that. And not for nothing, that's not always a great sign if you're seeing a repeated pattern of that with a coach with like all of their clients, right? And this is something like I have a discussion with a lot of competitors with, especially like I have a couple on my roster right now I can think of that they're in their first prep and they're like, they're those types of people. They're like, all right, I'm ready to push harder. Like, let's do this. Let's amp things up. And, their weight's dropping at a perfect rate week to week. And I always say like, and I have this girl, we had this discussion yesterday. She's like 14 weeks out, right? And she's like, all right, do we need to start cutting out all artificials, etc.? Her body's responding beautifully. And I said, honestly, no, your body is responding very well. What you're doing right now is working very well. And I mean, yes, you could make things harder on yourself by cutting out all artificials right now if that makes you feel better. But it's a matter of like, if you go too hard and extreme for that extended period of time, what happens post show is usually not going to be so great, right? And that's something I think a lot of, especially newer competitors, don't always understand, is they can't always foresee what's going to happen post show, right? And I'm not sitting here saying that you should have like, that whole IIFYM approach in your entire prep, right? But, you don't need to make it miserable for yourself for no reason and then come out after your show with a ton of binging problems because, oh my God, I restricted myself and only had the same 5 foods for the past 15 weeks, right? And a lot of people, a lot of competitors can't think that far ahead. They're thinking just about like the next several weeks and up until stage day, but a lot of them aren't thinking about setting themselves up for success post show with their, with their prep protocol.
Yeah, and I think a big issue with a lot of the negative things that happen in prep are people that want the results quicker, right? They want to push things. And that goes with all aspect, diet, training, nutrition, supplementation. I want it now, 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 now. Just like you, Lexi. I have a fair number of clients that are 14, 15 weeks out that are like, I don't feel like I'm going to be ready. I'm like, we're 15 weeks out.
Yeah.
Like, let's have this discussion a little bit closer, please.
Right.
It's,
Right.
I hope we don't feel ready 15 weeks out. That wouldn't
Exactly.
be a good place.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And you've even said it before many times on the podcast before, Evan, like as a coach, sometimes not for nothing, but when clients like, coach, I'll do whatever it takes, like, let's go. It's kind of like that almost worries us a little bit more because sometimes those same people, it's like they push really, really hard and then it kind of backfires on them post show. And those are not always, but usually the same people that have a very hard time post show with like, they push so damn hard and they were so extreme that they have like the opposite side of things after the show with like binging and not being able to control themselves from a caloric standpoint.
that's not just competitive clients, that's lifestyle clients I have as
I know.
well. They're like, anybody that wants to really push things to extreme, he almost always yo-yos. Almost always.
Yep.
Almost always, because it's not sustainable. I understand where their mindset's at, right? Because they want to push and get the results quicker so they can get back to their balanced lifestyle, but they never have a balanced lifestyle to begin with. It's always just a bunch of different variations of extremes.
Yeah, the artificial sweetener conversation when someone's like, when do I cut artificial sweeteners? That's something that I always say, well, like, how is your digestion on a daily basis? Great. How is your hunger signals? Great. Why are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Like,
Mhm.
like, not that I'm suggesting you should be, eating. Well, the thing is when your calories get low, you're going to be limited kind of on the foods you can choose anyway. And that's the beauty of flexible dieting and tracking your macros is if you take a bro who only eats clean and take someone who's a flexible dieter and put them on the same macros at the end of prep, their diets are going to look very similar. You can't fit crap into a diet like that. So what starts to happen is it happens to me every prep, and I talk about this all the time. It's a funnel. The beginning of prep, I'm like, cool, I can go to Chipotle today. I can have some Pop-Tarts now. And then by the end of prep, I'm eating the same 4 meals that Evan is eating. I'm super bro. I'm eating the same ground beef rice meal at this time, and I'm eating my egg whites at this time. Why? Because it digests well. It keeps me
Yep.
full. And I enjoy those meals. And what I've done is I've paid attention to my hunger signals during prep and what I enjoy, and I've just done more of that, but just been more diligent with weighing and tracking and dialing it in. And you don't want to make mistakes at the end of prep. You don't want to. But at no point have I ever said like, oh, I have to completely remove diet soda 6 weeks out from a prep. I think
There's
that
no
would
reason for that.
mess me up. Like sometimes between meals, that gets me through.
Right.
Um, and
Right. I
then,
think there are some scenarios, and I have this conversation with a lot of my clients, and like sometimes people they start consuming a little bit artificials and then it like builds to an obsessive nature. Like that's obviously not great, but sometimes, like you said, Paul, like a diet soda in prep or like a sparkling water or a little bit of sugar-free syrup in my coffee, like it keeps you sane, right? And it's almost like if you're not having adverse reactions to that, then why make things harder than it needs to be, you know?
Mhm. If you al- almost everything we talk about revolves around if your digestion's good, are we getting results, and are you feeling okay? Like
Right.
all this stuff kind of plays into that. There's times when it's time to buckle things down, but It's if we got to really buckle things down, if we need to remove artificial sweeteners completely at 6 weeks out, then we got more problems to deal with.
Exactly. And I think a lot of times that thought process of like, oh, do I need to eliminate this? Do I need to do this? It just stems from, we as athletes, we see what other athletes are doing. We hear what other athletes are doing. And sometimes, even these high up athletes like who are Olympians, they'll share a little bit of their protocol, whether it be if they have a YouTube channel or on their Instagram. And then, you hear, oh my gosh, well, so and so, she said she's cutting out all artificial sweeteners, at 5 weeks out. So, I probably need to do that too. But like, that's not always the case. And that's why we have coaches for a reason, because if every client and every athlete required the same approach in prep, like, well, we probably wouldn't have jobs. It would be really easy to get, oneself stage lean, but like,
Oh gosh, there would be people would just download an app and be like, "Oh, this is my prep app." Like, I've talked about the human body is so dynamic. And so the reason prep coaches get better at it over time is that we start to recognize patterns, we start to recognize people's behaviors, their ability to succeed, and we can adjust to them, right? I don't have a one size fits all approach. I have some very strong philosophical reasons, but you know, competitors trust prep coaches for a reason because
And
we get repeated results with completely different body types and personalities, in my opinion.
And here's the thing with artificial sweeteners, and everyone needs to read between the lines a little bit on this. Some people do better if they just remove it all because they don't have those hunger cues and things like that. And here's an example. Like throughout preps, I'll have like one or two of these a day, pretty much most of the prep, right? The last week, I'll kind of remove that stuff. But outside of that, I don't have a ton of artificial sweeteners. Now, if I have a client that's having 3 of these a day, 4 Diet Cokes, G Hughes sauce on every single thing that they're eating, a bunch of gum, then yeah, that's a lot. That's probably a little bit too much there.
So
Their
you said a
digestion's
magic
not going
word
to be
there,
great.
Evan. I had a client who was chewing so much gum that we figured out she was having like an extra 80 grams of carbs a day
Mhm.
from like sugar-free gum because it's not calorie-free.
No. And it's hard on your digestion when you start having that much in it. So for some people, they're not telling you why they remove it. They remove it because they can't help themselves. Right.
yeah,
Well,
So there's
there's another thing to consider that, I haven't heard much about it lately, but a while back, there were some companies selling some lower calorie options for foods. I remember it was like a brownie company. I don't
the
want to
brownie.
mention
Yeah.
names because I don't know what they're doing now. It was G Butter. It was the complete cookies. Just because it says something on the label does not make it so. And the brownies were something like they were being touted as like high protein brownies. And a registered dietitian friend of mine named Dylan had them tested. They were regular brownies. Like they were not high protein, low fat. They were low protein, high fat. And they were being sold by bodybuilders to bodybuilders. And lo and behold, you pulled that out of their diet and they just start dropping weight.
Mhm.
Um, so making your own food is another sign of eliminating variables, right? Like you need to be preparing your own food as much as possible. I do trust like some meal prep companies, like Icon Meals, but even at the end of prep, when they ship me something, I'm taking it out of the package and weighing it.
yeah. That's why, like, I think people who have competed before, this is not a surprise. But as a coach, if a first time athlete is like, "Hey, coach, can I go out to eat, or I'm going to eat out at this restaurant?" We're a couple weeks out. It's like, well, some people kind of get upset when you're like, "No, we can't do that." I mean, you can, but like, how do you know how much is being put into your food that the chef is making, right? So like in prep, it's really important to eliminate all of those potential like variables, and that's why like making your own food is so, my opinion, so important in just knowing exactly what's going into your food. I mean, I even have times where, like in prep, like I don't even want like someone else that I know to prepare my food. Like it's got to be me, just so I know 100% wholeheartedly what's going into
Mhm.
it. I think that's important.
That absolutely is the case.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the dangerous things with nutrition here. So I think we all agree super, super, super duper low fats for longest periods of time
Well,
are
so let's
not
start with the
beneficial either
highest
for
level
us.
is good versus bad foods, right? So then I think the next thing, Evan, is the perpetuation of meal plans that are not specific to any one individual, and they are basically, like I've seen coaches, they'll have like a couple meal plan templates. And like when their client gets stuck, they give them the next lower one, then the next lower one.
That's a lot of coaches, yeah.
And if you're not, I mean, this is the conversation I have with consults. And if you guys want to consult with us, go to prophysique.com. Consultations are free. If you're in prep, you're worried about how things are going and you just want to have a conversation, that's what we do. You can DM us, you can message us. It's part of our job that we love. But one of the common things I have is, hey, where are your calories or your macros? Oh, I'm on a meal plan. Cool. Let's plug it in.
Yep.
Let's plug it in. And lo and behold, yeah, you're at 800 calories 16 weeks out from a show, below 10 grams of fat. And you know, I've said there are coaches that talk about no fat, no carb diets. It's just unnecessary, and that is, now we were talking about acute dangers, like, you know, you can stop your heart in peak week. This is more long-term dangers where you can set yourself back hormonally, give yourself, you know, digestive issues for years.
Yeah, I see the I use this as an example quite frequently, but I had a client who came to me a couple years ago from a coach who had her on a very restrictive meal plan, and it was like the same 5 foods, and she was on that for so long. And honestly, when she came to me, she had the worst digestion because she hadn't had so like variety in her diet for so long. She was so low fat, so low carb. And we had to spend like a good solid year just getting her back to a spot where she could tolerate more variety with her foods, right? So, yeah, I see like the very restrictive meal plans that are the same, like 3 to 4 or 5 foods, like those in the long term usually cause a lot of digestion problems for people. Because I know this is not what anybody usually likes to hear, but a lot of digestion issues are brought upon by yourself, meaning like you limit yourself so severely for so long that you develop these intolerances to foods you haven't had in so long, right? So I see that being an issue. And like the low fats, I think we can probably all agree that generally when clients are very low fat, not only does it impact their hormone health, but like also digestion. I feel like clients who are not getting in much dietary fats, their digestion just sucks. And not to mention, like most vitamins and minerals are fat soluble. So if you're not getting in dietary fat, you're not able to absorb those vitamins and minerals that you're getting in from your food, right? So there can be a lot of just like micronutrient deficiencies, and it just can be such a cascading negative domino effect.
And the quality matters too, right? Especially when it comes to fats here. All fats are not, almost over any other macronutrient. Fats are not created equal on how they impact your
Well, and
body,
you
how
get
they
so
impact your
few, Evan, that
digestion.
they have to be high quality.
They have to matter.
You're only getting 40 grams of fat a day. You don't want it to be from, you know, a processed food that has 10 grams of fat.
And you don't want it from chicken thighs, right? Like you want it from good
Speak for yourself. I
quality
like me some
fats.
chicken.
I mean, they're great, but they're not great for you.
How about
right?
ribeye? What, can I get it from a ribeye?
Yes. Yes. You know, it's when you don't have a lot, you need to make it matter. And I had a conversation the other day from one of my lifestyle clients, and he was like, well, Paul eats Pop-Tarts every day. I was like, well, Paul's not at 120 grams of carbs right now, is he?
Oh, I'm at 120 for breakfast.
Right? Like it's you got to pick and choose your battles here, buddy. He's like,
And if
I'm
I'm being
starving.
honest,
I was like, well, I bet
I've
you are, because
actually,
you're taking half your carbs and fats with Pop-Tarts.
I've pulled the Pop-Tarts out recently just to try some stuff. So like, yeah, but again, I'm also a very active dad, tennis player, bodybuilder, you know, so I get up and do cardio every day, playing tennis, you know, on occasion, running around with the kids, going to the gym, you know, so like, believe me, when the going gets tough, when I'm down on 200 carbs a day or below, I'm not getting 75 of that from a Pop-Tart.
No,
Right.
no.
Just not.
A lot of stuff can be fixed here by just saying it out loud. Does this sound right? A lot of us have common sense. A lot of this stuff, you can just say it out loud. It doesn't sound right. It's probably not. It's probably not.
Yeah, and I think like when in doubt, this sounds so obvious, but I talk to a lot of athletes that they're afraid to do this, like because I know you guys probably as well get plenty of DMs of people that are like, hey, can I run this past you? Or like, my coach has me doing this. What do you think? And honestly, when in doubt, if something does not sit right with you with what your coach is having you do, like, I know it's sometimes hard, but don't be afraid to ask questions. Like, you're not being rude by asking your coach, hey, could you just explain to me, like, why are you having me do this? I think some people think like, oh, if I'm questioning my coach, like they're going to get upset with me. And honestly, every coach should have an answer. If you ask a question as to why are we doing this, and they don't have a logical answer, there's your answer right there. They probably don't know what they're doing, right? If you ask, hey, why am I on this meal plan with no fat and no carbs, and they don't have like a logical answer to back that up, if it's just, hey, nope, do as I say, this is what it takes, like, sorry, that's not an answer. And that's a red flag right there. So don't be afraid. Like, if anything we're talking about, if you are currently experiencing this with your coach, don't be afraid to first give them the benefit of the doubt and just ask, hey, why are we doing this? And if they don't have a logical answer, again, there's your answer right there.
100%. I'm a creature of curiosity, and from day one of this job, or even from when I started competing, the reason I chose my first coach was because he was talking about a lot of things that didn't make sense to me, and when I asked him, he had a reason. Um, and luckily for me, well, I say luck. I don't think it was luck. I think the reason I decided to compete was because I found somebody online that kind of made sense to me. I was like, okay, I see what this person's doing. I see the results he's getting, and I'm like, okay, now I'm in. Okay, so that's what got me excited. Um, I did not decide to compete because I saw Phil Heath or Laura Lee or somebody on stage and go, oh my gosh, I want to look like them. No coach is going to get you the results like that. That is not a coach's job. That is freaking genetics. Okay.
And years and consistency and hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. And listen, a coach is going to help those people, but I mean, in the case of Laura Lee, she succeeded in spite of her coach for many years. Now she's thriving, but like you see that quite often. You see athletes who do very well despite having a coach that's not actually giving them the best platform for them. And so that's where it can be a little bit muddled when you're coming into this space.
Yes.
I was just very, I guess, when I came in to decide to compete, I had probably spent more than a year following along some forums and messaging people. And when I finally decided to pull the trigger, it was still a culture shock. But anytime I asked Lane, like, hey, you've got me eating a lot of carbs. Why? And he had an answer. He said, well, you were eating a lot of calories. You were just eating a ton of fat and low protein. So now that you're eating enough protein and enough carbs, your training is going to be better. Carbohydrates are fantastic for performance. And after 20 years of training in the gym, I was hitting PRs every week. I was like, what is happening? It was the first time in my life I dialed in my nutrition. I'd have the odd day where like I felt great in the gym, but it was probably after a weekend of overeating carbs, and you get lucky, but there's something amazing when you dial your nutrition in and you just feel great every day. Like that phase of prep, that like
Right.
8 to 10 to 12 weeks, when you're not at the beginning of prep, because it takes a couple weeks to get in the zone, but you get in that zone before you're too lean to enjoy it. And it's just like you're operating at such a high level
Yeah.
that, man,
I call
And
it
you mentioned something, Paul, that I want to reiterate on too, where you're talking about like athletes and doing well and good athletes. There's a lot of really good athletes. Look, if you're a good athlete, you're gonna perform well with a good coach or without a good coach. If you're a
yeah,
high level athlete, you're gonna be in the mix because you're a really good athlete. A lot of athletes in this sport are successful despite of their coach and their guidance on things. They are. A lot of it most people will never see. A lot of it's behind the scenes stuff. A lot of it is emotional things. There's a ton of factors that play into this. So again, it's one of those conversations and one of those topics that goes a lot deeper than a lot of people think it does.
well,
Surface level.
and here's a great way to look at it. Be wary of coaches that take too much credit and don't take enough blame.
Yep.
The athletes, the ones getting on stage, are the one doing the work. They are the ones that have the genetics. They are the ones that have decided to throw their hat in the ring and get on stage. Be wary of the people that don't compete, but yet coach competitors and are so happy to take all the praise, but you never really hear about the bad stuff. You know, that's coaching. Coaching is getting hit on the chin and going, okay, what can I do better for this athlete? And if you have the fortune of coaching a great athlete for many years, and seeing them evolve, that to me is the most rewarding part of this sport. Unfortunately, we're now in an era, at least it seems like, where coach girls or even men, they're coach hopping. Like they're giving a coach like a year or two, and then they're like, okay, on to the next, on to the next.
Oh yeah, I see that all the time. I was just thinking about that actually a couple days ago, and it just like I don't know. Not to go off on a whole tangent. It frustrates me when you see people
Oh
doing that.
yeah,
Like
it's
as a
frustrating,
coach.
but it's also the reality, and I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
gonna bash it or be like you know, you can't change it. You can change how you respond to it. And I'm not going to say, you know, I haven't been frustrated at times, but I've also been very blessed that I get to work with such amazing people that if I have somebody that I'm very passionate about can be great and they leave, I've got a whole other, you know, an
yeah,
influx of people. So, you know, it's like what those football coaches say, like when they lose their best player, we're playing with what we got. Like, and guess what? You know, like, I don't know if you guys have been watching basketball, but the best basketball team in the country lost the best basketball player in the country, and they still just went and won the ACC tournament and are the number one team in the country. So you pull the best player off the best team, you think they would fold. Nope. You, that means that coach is doing a good job. He's producing more than one talented athlete. It's the same thing with prep coaches. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Here's a great thing too. This is kind of a topic, but if you want to judge a coach on how they're doing, don't necessarily judge them based off their athletes and their placing. Judge them based off their athlete progression. How well have their athletes progressed? How healthy are their athletes? How good do they feel? All these things matter because if you feel
That
good
can be
and
hard
you
to
look good, you're
track,
going to
though, to
stay in
be
there
honest,
longer.
Evan, because very few people are documenting that. Like it's hard. I try to do it to an extent on YouTube. Like if you watch kind of my prep videos, I'll talk about their history, but even that becomes challenging for me. Like, like it's hard to document that. I'm terrible at Instagram. I'm lucky if I make one or two posts a week. And sometimes it can feel like it's just a highlight reel. Um, but yeah, I'm just saying, like, that's a hard, I think all of us, Lexi, I know you do a great job of showing like progressions, and Evan, you do a great job.
I
Some
need to
of our
do
other
better.
coaches, like Matt and Steven, we show that. We also have the people that enter our transformation challenges that make amazing changes in 90 days, and beyond. But it can be hard if you're looking for a coach and trying to
Mhm.
find that. It can be a challenge.
That's
yeah.
true.
Absolutely. Well, should we talk a little bit about, we've talked a lot about nutrition. Should we talk a little bit about some dangerous like cardio and training protocols?
Yeah, I think there's far fewer
Yeah, I would
concerns
agree.
around training and around cardio, specifically around cardio. I mean, the only thing I would worry about with training is extremely high volume per session where you're just not recovering. You're constantly beat up. So I had an athlete and I sent her a training program, and after a couple of weeks, she was like, "My joints are sore. The scale is up. I can't sleep." And I was like, "We need to jump on a phone call. That should not be the case." She had misinterpreted the program I had written her, and so it said 4 sets, 20, 15, 12, 8. And this is just an example. She was doing that 4 times.
Oh
She
God.
wasn't doing 15, 12, 8. She was doing 20, 15, 12, 8. Start over. 20.
Oh
Next
wow. Wow.
exercise. She was taking 2.5 hours to get through the workout.
Wow.
Within 2 weeks, she was like, "I'm hitting PRs and I feel like a new person." Well, I'm like, "Yeah, you're super compensated because you basically ran yourself into the ground, pulled back the volume." And that's what powerlifters do. They kind of super compensate. I used to coach a lot of powerlifters, and you build the volume up so high, and then you would pull it down real low, and then they would go do their meet, and they would hit PRs at the meets. And I think what happened to this young lady was she just went back to normal training volume after doing too much. And she was like, "This is crazy." But that's really with training I mean,
Yeah.
other than dangerous exercises. Like I saw a video the
Yeah.
other day of a young lady squatting 600 pounds, and the spotter missed the bar and she died. Like, okay,
God,
we're
that's
not going to talk about, yeah, like it landed on
no,
her neck.
no.
But outside of that, yeah.
The only thing like I can kind of think of when it comes to training is the volume obviously, but every once in a while I'll get people that, they'll tell me that they're like pretty much training or doing cardio or like doing something 7 days a week and there's like no rest day ever. And I feel like especially in prep, like that is just not great. I mean, I know I am big on at least I want one day out of the week where you are intentionally resting because I find that if you don't get that, especially in prep, it is just a disaster in terms of inflammation. Your recovery is so shitty. You can't sleep well. You're inflamed all the time. You're not dropping weight. Your workout quality is terrible. So I feel like that's a little bit of a red flag to me, like just always perpetually training 7 days a week without ever having a rest day. Like that's just to me, I mean, I feel like we're beyond that now, but I still hear some scenarios where that's happening. And I'm like, oh, yeah, let's not do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's zero reason to train with weights 7 days a week.
Oh,
Zero.
yeah,
There's zero
absolutely.
reason to train with weights, honestly, in a prep, like 6 days a week. I
Agreed.
don't know what you're supposed to do with that. It's just junk volume at that point. It's not that it's not dangerous. It's just not gonna help you and you're gonna look worse.
Counterintuitive. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
counterintuitive and yeah, it's just silly. I always tell my athletes if you don't need your rest days, you are not training hard enough in the first place,
that's
right?
right.
Like it's kind of a good gauge to, identify if you're training hard enough in the first place. If you feel like you could train 7 days a week, you're probably not doing something right with your intent in the gym.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that also speaks maybe to an exercise addiction when someone's like, I just love being in the gym.
true.
I'm like, yeah, but if you're not taking a couple days off, I'm more worried about you than,
Yep.
yeah, those.
Yeah, yeah, I totally understand that because I've had a couple clients even recently, and not even contest prep clients, but they're like, the gym is my therapy, my mental outlet. Like I have to go every day. And I'm like, well, I get that. Believe me, I get the gym being a mental outlet, but I also think you need to have more than one mental outlet. If you are always just relying strictly on the gym as that only form of like mental outlet, like you can't go 7 days a week. That's just not going to be realistic. And you need to have something else you can also do to help to ease that stress and that cortisol. You can't just 100% always be reliant on the gym for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think.
and when it comes to cardio, I mean, some clients require more than others, right? But it's our job as a coach to be able to listen to the client, um, and see how they're feeling, right? And that's one thing I get across to all the people I work with is, hey, this is not necessarily a toughness conversation here. This is I need to know how you're feeling and how you're recovering. Now, it's our job to actually interpret that, right? And Paul, I know you'll do this. You'll hop on the phone call, people start feeling really tired and listen to them, right? And if you hop on the phone, they're, hey, how are you? And everything is all good to go. Maybe they aren't just the best at judging how tired they are. If you get on the phone and they're like, I'm fine, and you get on the phone with them and they can barely put words together, you know, maybe it's the opposite direction on that. And they're trying to act a little bit tougher than, not that they're not tough, right? They're obviously tough, but kind of downplaying how run down they feel.
Yeah, I think one thing, and you, me, Lexi, we're all guilty of this in prep. We don't realize how run down we are because we're so focused on our goal. And it's almost like the frog in the boiling water analogy, where like the frog will die because it doesn't realize the water is boiling because it gradually gets hotter and hotter. With prep, there's definitely been preps where at the end of prep, I was like, man, I feel great. And then I would take like a recovery week and be like, okay, I didn't realize how crappy I felt. I was just so, I had just so gotten used to it. I think as human beings, like, I hate to think about like tragic times in human history, but like the human condition is adaptable to almost anything. Like when you think about like concentration camp scenarios or like even like medieval times, like when we talk about we're suffering in prep, oh, we're suffering while we sleep in our bed and eat our 4 meals and go to the gym and do our 2 hours of cardio. I
Mhm.
mean, the Minnesota starvation experiment, they were doing like 12 hours of manual labor on 1,000 calories. They were fine. They survived.
It's
Um,
easy to normalize your circumstances once you've dealt with them for long enough too. Because like,
you just get
yeah,
used to it. Yeah.
And I noticed that too when it comes to stress levels. Like I'm sure you guys find this to be the case too. Like especially with clients, usually the most stressed out people don't even realize or want to even admit that they're stressed out because they've just normalized that amount of stress for so long. And then all it takes is okay, maybe a week off of work or a week on a vacation and they're like, holy crap, like I dropped 3 pounds, like what happened? And I'm like, you relaxed and you probably don't realize how much stress you're carrying around in your normal day to day because you've normalized it for so long.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
that's, like I can tell you as a parent, there was years where I didn't realize, like from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to bed, I was stressed because it was like, you're just running from thing to thing, getting things done, kids and pets and work and travel and, like you don't, and then when you actually don't have that on you for a day or two, you're like, whoa, I didn't realize that was happening. And so the same thing happens with
Mhm.
prep, and it's not a bad thing. I mean, stress creates diamonds, right? So I think avoiding stress completely is pointless, but understanding that it can be really good for you. And this is like, my favorite thing about, making people successful when the prep is over is that taking little breaks in prep, 2, 3 days at a time, sometimes a full week of just pulling out the cardio, bringing the food up, not having to step on the scale, take pictures, like that can feel really good. And can set the person up for success after the prep.
Mhm.
The worst thing you can do as a competitor, in my opinion, if you want to be successful after the prep, and by success I mean avoiding the disordered behaviors, not have rapid body fat gain, not have terrible body dysmorphia, is not just go, okay, it's 12 weeks all in, week 1 double cardio 1,000, like not have that type of a prep where it's literally just start to finish a grind. But you know give yourself some grace if you can.
Yeah.
Don't pick a hard show date. Pick a show date and go, you know what, if I'm not ready for this one, let me give myself another 4 weeks, take a little bit of a recovery. Don't go backwards, just maintain and then go forwards. And that, when I see that, I mean, I had this conversation with a client of mine, Daniela, and I was a little nervous to have it because she wanted to do the Arnold. And I was looking at her and looking at my other girls, and I was like, listen, Daniela, I want to tell you this, but like, we are not going to be competitive to win. And I thought she was going to take it poorly. She's like, I'm so glad you said that. I feel the same way. We took a recovery week. We picked another show. She looks incredible right now. And had I run her into the ground to get her on the stage at the Arnold, now it would have been a completely different scenario than when we're going to be starting the season in a couple of weeks. And she's had multiple diet breaks. She's leaner. She looks better. So yeah, it's something that you've got to be aware of, is that the human body responds favorably if you treat it well.
Mhm.
Absolutely. A healthy body is a responsive body for sure. So, do we want to kind of end out this podcast episode on? Do we want to talk a little bit about just like some very loose kind of generalized like drug protocols that can be just alarming or kind of red flag?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about drug protocols for like peak week that would cause problems.
Yeah. I know we kind of talked before we started this episode about that. And so I feel like, and we talked, all three of us, we talked a little bit about how it's really hard in this industry to like find reputable, like knowledgeable, accredited people to discuss.
So here's actually, that's a great question. If you guys are still listening, comment below if there are some podcasts or people you listen to, because these are people that I would like to interview and have on here. We've discussed off the air, like, okay, these are people. So I may be reaching out to some people, not only to further my own education, but to bring light and shine a light on people who are doing things the right way. Um, but yeah, a product that I wasn't too familiar with, Evan, that when I said it to you, you said that is the most dangerous bodybuilding drug in the world, was DNP. Um, I had heard the initials before, but obviously it's now associated with the potential death of someone. And so, do you want to talk a little bit about DNP and its dangers, Evan?
I mean, it's typically used as a fat burner, and it's one of those things that if you need to implement that, you probably are not in a place where you need to be in a prep. Um, Look, there's extremes to everything, right? And I would definitely say that's on the high end of extreme for things. And everything, when you talk about supplementation, it's again, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Like, is the benefit going to be worth it? And that is absolutely one of them. That is not the case. Not, in my opinion, it's not. And in the vast majority of coaches, it's not. It's not. There are far better options that are far safer than that compound. It's not something I would ever prescribe. It's not something I would ever take. Um, it's not something I would feel safe even discussing with a client on that end with it. And look, I mean, does it work? Yeah, it does. That's why people use it. And a lot of coaches will use things like that as a shortcut with it, as a band-aid for lazy coaching, right? Just like a lot of females that I know, that I don't coach, but I know other people coach, they will overdo things like the clenbuterol so they can get away with doing less cardio and eat more junk. And
So
it's
it's
not a
called
band-aid.
dinitrophenol. Dinitrophenol, obviously everyone calls it DNP. The issue, Evan, is that it has a significant risk of acute toxicity. So I
Mhm.
heard Dave Palumbo talking about it, and he said the range that you have to take based on your body weight is so small. If you don't take enough, has zero effect. If you take too much, you can die. So it's like it's this tiny little window that you have to operate in to be effective and safe. And like you said, it even he said it's just not worth it. And so,
Not worth it. It's not worth it. It's not worth it.
yeah, interesting.
I think another thing that people use, and not necessarily this isn't going to put you in the hospital or anything, is the use of thyroid medications like T3. Um, I can there I think there are probably some situations where if your thyroid is down regulated and you need to supplement that to able to get back to a certain point, okay, that could be discussed, but that's not what most people are using it for. Most people are using it to speed up their thyroid to speed up fat loss. They're not using it to supplement it, they're using it to enhance the fat loss. And when you start doing things like that, it can make the reverse almost impossible. And especially in females, which typically struggle more with thyroid issues than anyone, it's it causes long-term issues in a lot of people. And that's just another one that is just not worth it. It's not worth it. It's not worth it.
Yeah, and I think we talked briefly about this, like I think it was last week. I don't think it was on the podcast, but we kind of had our little chit chat before we started. And I think what some people don't realize too is some of these drugs, you push them so hard in prep, and there's gonna come a point where like you do have to come off or you have to ease your foot off the gas pedal. And for some, especially females, it can be hard to see your body go from like that crazy shredded full muscular level of conditioning to when you have to come off of those things and dealing with like the psychological side of like having to get softer and seeing yourself off of those drugs. I've known people that really struggle with that. And I don't think that people always think about that too. And they're pushing things so aggressively of like when they eventually come off, you're going to have to deal with seeing yourself looking pretty different compared to when you were, full throttle with all the PEDs.
And that's part of it too. But when it comes to thyroid medications as well, if you don't handle that correctly, and even if you do handle it correctly, you can have some reverse effects with it to the fact that you don't, a lot of these girls, like you would look at them post show and they blow up 20 pounds. You think they're just binge eating and stuff. They're not binge eating or anything. They're not. They're not. They just can't handle any food because their thyroid is so jacked up post show with it. Um, it's
Yeah.
it's a tricky situation. It's a difficult one. And again, it's one of those things. Does things have a purpose for some people? Yes. But there's a lot of coaches out there will just
So are
prescribe
you
athletes
talking about like
T3 straight off the
injectable
rip.
T3, Evan, like an injectable T3, like that's an immediate? Because I've had many clients that were on a thyroid supplement, like I think it's called thyroxine, which takes a couple weeks to like build up its effects, but it's
No, it's not
essentially
shy. It's oral pills. I mean, but
okay.
people will take them and they'll overtake them to be able to speed up the fat loss. Yeah. I mean, it speeds up your thyroid
So
hormone.
in my experience, I've had a couple people, I won't name names, but very good athletes that were taking T3 without telling me, and they lost a significant amount of muscle.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, that's what
I
I
mean, it turned your
noticed.
body back catabolic too. Yeah,
When
I mean,
I asked,
absolutely.
I was like, okay, so what have you done? Like, what's because your physique's changing? Oh, I'm taking T3. Okay,
Just like
and
people with overactive thyroids, right? They have a hard time putting
yeah,
on muscle. Saying it's similar to that. You're basically making your thyroid overactive.
right. So that combined with low calorie, high cardio, you're basically just burning through more muscle.
Burn it through it.
Um,
Yep. And unless you're on a copious amount of PEDs to help maintain that. But even at that point too, you're still going to burn through it. The conversation I've had with open bodybuilders and big classic guys, right? To where their coach had overprescribed them T3, trying to get them inside out peeled, and they end up losing muscle throughout the process with it. They're on every compound in the book with it. Um,
yeah.
it's the race to be peeled, right? And people will do a lot of stuff to get there. And I think again, T3, it's not something that's going to put you in the hospital, right? But it's something that can really impact you long term.
Yeah, I think so. My concern as a coach, who's traveled down the road of the enhanced athlete is I go to shows every week for the last 10 years. And in the last 2 or 3 years, maybe even a few extra more, the drastic change I see from year to year in females, the visual change of their face and their voice has what's been the most shocking. And to my understanding, this is just when they're compounding multiple, because, I've had girls take oxandrolone and have zero negatives. You wouldn't even know. They just look a little more muscular. They retain more muscle to the point where sometimes I'm like, damn, I feel like oxandrolone should be over the counter. It's just so, especially if you're getting it pharmaceutical grade through a hormone therapy person, which you should because it's easily faked, right, Evan? Like that's one of the most
No, yeah,
faked.
it's one of the most, that and Primo, which with in females, that and Primobolan are probably two of the more highly taken compounds, and they're both the
Yeah.
most faked compounds.
Yeah, and even primobolan, I've seen a similar effect that I've seen on Anavar when it's real,
Mhm.
or oxandrolone, which is the pharmaceutical name for Anavar. Um, Very mild, just benefits is what I've seen, and
It low, moderate
dosages under
dosages.
20
Yeah.
milligrams a day. 5 to 15 milligrams a day, very, very safe. But the thing that concerns me is when I see people they're on HRT, so they're taking testosterone shots. They're taking Anavar, they're taking Primo, I've seen Winstrol, I've seen like
Mhm.
just very aggressive. And this is where, like aging, like I don't know if these women realize, and there's a natural, I mean, I'm 50, like, I'm gonna be 50 this year. There's a natural component to aging, but I'm telling you, girls go from 22 to 32 like that, it visually,
Yep.
or 32 to 42. So that's where my concern is as a coach. I don't want to be the person that does that. And it's like walking this line. And this is where I feel like there is a gap for education amongst the athletes, Lexi. And you can tell me, is there someone that you would trust? Because are you supposed to trust it based on the way their athletes look? Because with
Yeah,
the athletes, sometimes I think the summit fever is the thing. Like the
exactly.
coach is like just a little bit more, just a little bit more. And
Yeah, I think it is hard, and and we'll, Paul, you and I were talking before we started this. We may have, some people that we may be able to invite on to the podcast in the future that can talk a little bit more exclusively on these things, like not necessarily coaches, but people who have, like, they're a nurse, or they're a nurse practitioner, they have a degree in this, so we can give you guys some more reputable information too. Because I mean, I know personally, gosh, I don't, when it comes to your health and when it comes to PEDs and potential virilization as a female, I know for me personally, I would be very careful at who I took advice from, right? If it was just a coach, even if that coach was producing a ton of pros, like, I think personally for me, I'd have a hard time trusting that person unless they had like that background and that, I don't know, that knowledge or they were working with like a medical professional who was also helping the athletes. So yeah, so like we talked about before the podcast, we'll hopefully be able to get somebody on in the future too, to talk a little bit more about this stuff for you guys, and also just so we can all kind of learn from it.
yeah,
And look, and when we talk about things like Anavar, right? Let's compare that to something like the artificial sweeteners I was talking about with it. If you low to moderate amounts of it is going to be not necessarily beneficial like artificial sweeteners, but it's not going to negatively impact you. right? For most people. For some females can take a small amount of Anavar and it can cause virilization with things like their voice. Some do. It's not impossible. But for the most of it, it's not going to be the case. But if you're taking 25 milligrams of it for 20 weeks at a time, some shit's going to change.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
I
going
mean,
to change.
and that's the one thing about, working with medical providers, the hormone therapy clinics, the longest they'll allow my athletes to take it is 8 weeks. So if your coach is extending it beyond 8 weeks, there's got to be a reason and you got to have a plan. I'm not saying if you're 2 weeks out, you should cut it out. If you want to keep on it, do it for those extra 2 weeks. But I've had people come to me that are like, oh, I've been on it for 6 months. And I'm like, this is where you can get into some health issues. There's a reason why there's liver toxicity
Yeah.
because of this product that your body has to process every single day. Like, look up Walter Payton. He died early because he was taking painkillers and he did not know that aspirin was processed by the liver. Like, you guys that are taking things for too long, these organs are not replaceable.
And it's dosages over time too, right? Like you can typically run things a little bit longer if it's a much smaller dosages because it's dosage over time with things. But there needs to be a reason for it, right? There needs to be a reason. And a good rule of thumb for everyone that remember this is the least you can take and get results is going to be beneficial because means your body is going to be healthier. The more you add these compounds in, the more toxicity that's going to come into your body, the worse your body's going to end up responding. There is diminishing returns with everything with this, with everything.
Yeah.
Well, the one thing I've liked about oxandrolone is that I've noticed, like, if I have someone do 8 week cycle and then take 4 weeks off and then do another 8 weeks, they're progressing each time with a little more muscle, a little more density. They don't need to skyrocket to go from amateur to Olympia in 6, 8 weeks, right? It's more like it's just assisting their progress. So they're getting no negatives. They're just getting the benefits, right? And so that's what I've liked about it. I haven't felt this like, okay, putting these people in harm's way or shortening their careers because, not for nothing. We've had a lot of people win the Olympia then retire.
In a lot of ways, you can actually, and this might be not like the hottest take with it, but a lot of times a little bit of that stuff can extend people's careers because it can make them more competitive. It can make them happier. It can make their placings better. It makes it to where they feel like they're putting in the work and getting the results with it. So things at smaller amounts can help progress people and help them stay in the sport a little bit longer for some, depending on kind of what their overall goals are with things on there. But again, that's a person dependent thing, right? And that's what we do as coaches is talk to people and find out. Like
Listen, I love that it's an open conversation now because it used to be cloak and dagger behind the scenes, who's doing what. You'd hear rumors. Now, literally, I've seen people post their blood work, post their drug cycles, so but I also sometimes think like, well, that's not necessary. That's what you're doing. But also there's very clearly, and we'll see this year. Listen, the numbers will tell. Are the numbers for bikini, which is the division, which is now where, at this point, if you're at the Olympia, you're on drugs and probably a decent amount. It's not a question anymore. Is that division going to continue to shrink like it did last year? Like the smallest it's been in almost a decade since it started it's the smallest division the division has been. And the Arnold they had a few more athletes than last year, but wasn't a huge amount. So we'll see. We'll see at the national shows.
I have a rule of thumb I function off of, and I think it's a good rule of thumb for most people. If you cannot, I'm not saying do this, but Paul, you brought up like people post their cycles online. If you could not take your cycle and post it online and feel confident about it, then it's probably too much.
Or I thought you were going to say this, Evan. I think on the flip side too, especially if you're newer into the sport or you are considering going the enhanced route, if you can't nail the basics, like in terms of your nutrition, your cardio, your training, your sleep, your stress management, like in my opinion, you should not even be thinking about PEDs until you can master those basic fundamentals first.
100%.
I heard somebody once say, because I was always a natural bodybuilder, and I think I asked the guy in the gym like, oh, should I, is that something I should consider? And he said, honestly, I don't think if you can't win an overall title in the NPC level naturally, you're doing drugs is a waste of time for you. Like, it's not going to take you from, you know, where you're at to, you know, like there's a risk reward. Is it worth it for Derek and Samson, who just won $1 million? Yeah, maybe that's their decision.
I also think if you're talking about like PEDs of that level, right? I can tell you this: if it's a decent sized show, I don't know a guy who can win an overall natural unless he is a complete genetic freak of nature with that.
Well, I think you're probably not going to as many. I've won an overall in classic physique in the NPC.
Well, I also think it comes
Was
down
it the
to
biggest show? No, but I was the most shredded, and you know what I'm saying? So like,
yeah, I mean,
yeah, like there are going to like the show you did with Steve judging with 150 men's physique guys, that was basically nationals the week before nationals. Yeah, those guys were fucking huge. But I've also been to, you know, a Midwest show and been like, okay, right?
Yeah.
So
I'm more talking about like
I'm not
bigger
saying
size
that's
shows,
gospel. I'm just saying that's the advice the guy gave me. And this was obviously 20 years ago when I did my first show. And, you know, I knew somebody, Dominic D'Agostino, who won a bodybuilding overall as a natural, but he was a freak of nature as a natural. But that's the kind of guy that you take your Doug Miller, who can win an overall in an NPC show.
Yeah.
And he does a cycle. Now you're talking Olympia caliber.
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about that, that's like Olympia caliber stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
I also
for
think
sure.
like you have to evaluate too if you're considering going the enhanced route. Like, what is your long-term goal with competing, right? Like, if you're just
Right.
doing it for fun, you know, like I don't, in my opinion, I don't like it's not worth it. If you're just doing it for fun, you want to show up every time, improve, like it may not be worth it. Now, if your goal is okay, you know, I want to turn pro, I want to do well at the pro league, maybe that's another scenario. But I think you have to like evaluate what is your end goal with it. You know what I mean? How long do you want to compete? I think that's something to consider. And like we could do a whole other podcast on this, but I think this is a good bolus dose of information for the people today.
For sure.
Agree.
For sure. Well, thank you guys for listening to the Pro Physique Code. Comment below any person that you think would be a good interview. I met with Alan Aragon. I met with Brad Schoenfeld, Brett Contreras. If you guys would like to have them on the podcast, comment below. Could be some exciting guests coming up. All right,
I'm
guys.
so excited too, because by the time this is out, we'll have had our Command the Stage event this weekend. So very excited for that.
It's going to be wonderful, and we'll be documenting it. I've got George coming.
All right. Thanks for listening, guys.
Bye.